Good afternoon and good evening, I should say. It's already 6 o'clock, so probably we rather stick to good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this lecture. To a lecture which is having a couple of frameworks around it, I have to say. On the one hand, it is a lecture which takes place in the Jean Monnet network EU Cross. So if you haven't heard about EU Cross, it's actually a network of various universities, 12 in total, all over the world, that are looking into the role of Europe in a changing international order. Europe at the crossroads. And it's a great pleasure to have, in fact, as our guest speaker, one of our collaborators in that network, Dr. Magdalena Góra from Jagellonian University in Kraków with us tonight. At the same time, this lecture is obviously, and you all know it, the end of a long day here in Leuven. We have had wonderful talks, we had wonderful interactions during the conference, and all of you are obviously now looking forward to the official end of this conference, which I think will be coming to a close through a lecture which couldn't be more topical and could not be more speaking to the challenging times which we see Europe in today, contesting the European Union as a regional actor, the EU's neighborhood and enlargement policies in perspective. And Magdalena Góra will speak about her ongoing research in the field. She's an expert on European foreign policy. She's an expert also, I should say, on international relations, because she has done her PhD, very interestingly, on the history of Polish-Israel relations from the Second World War onwards. And she owned her PhD from Jagellonian University earlier in the 2000s. She, in the meantime, has worked in many European projects. She is a constant, I should say, a constant traveler to the United States of America, and she has just told me that she actually has gained or owned and celebrated that she will be a Fulbright Scholar next year at New York University. So this kind of relationship with the United States continues. She is the author and editor of various journal articles and books on European foreign policy, but also on democracy, on contestation, expertization, collective identity, and European integration in Central and Eastern Europe. Last but not least, she kicks off our two-day celebrations in the context of 30 years of the Master of European Studies here at KU Leuven. So this is the last, but not the least, framework that I would like to mention. She will also be on the panel tomorrow. I will say a little bit later what that panel will be about. But now it's time for a big round of applause. Welcome with me, Magdalena Góra.
Thank you very much for having me. And it's a great honor and pleasure to present a research that I'm conducting back home in Kraków with my wonderful colleagues. And it's a great pleasure to also be within all of those frameworks that Kolja mentioned.
Okay. Yeah, go on.
So what I want to talk today about with you is project that the kind of results of a project that deals with the question which puzzled me for a while in terms of how do domestic EU actors within the EU, what they think and what they say about the EU as a regional actor, specifically as about the relations in the close neighbors. And as you all know, EU is a regional actor in the neighborhood, but also we are within a framework of the Master of European Studies, so you all guys know very well it's a very complicated structure, right? So most of our attention usually goes, when we talk about the European foreign policy, it goes to the CFSP, CSDP framework. But my idea was slightly different. And instead of going to the place when we sort of find most of the foreign policy actions, I wanted to look into two policies that are specifically designed for relations with neighbors: European neighborhood policy and European enlargement. It's actually in the reverse order. EU enlargement first, and European neighborhood policy. And why is that? There's several reasons why it's actually good not to look into the place which is the intergovernmental, or supposed to be intergovernmental process. Both policies, EU enlargement and ENP, as you guys know, are a mixed mode of governance, right, to say it clearly. They are governed by Commission, specifically DG NEAR and Commissioner, but they have also links to the CFSP and its institutions, High Representative and the External Actions Services. They also are made of specific instruments, right? As you all know, European enlargement is actually as long as integration in itself, or just slightly younger, from 70s. But as a policy, sort of, it was an ad hoc process initially, right? It became policy specifically in the 90s, specifically. I mean, it already started to institutionalize greatly in the southern enlargement, but it became more and more institutionalized as a policy facing Big Bang enlargement. And it's obviously another privilege to speak here on the 15th anniversary that we just passed of the Eastern enlargement, right? And it became a policy that is institutionalized, that has its specific political process, specific institutions, specific competences. But I call it a law politics of foreign policy, so to say. And because it's a law politics, because you don't have that much attention to the sort of high, hardcore foreign policy issues, I found it more interesting to see how the contestation looks like, because there is more space for variety of political actors to have input in this policy process. On the other hand, obviously, we have scholars in the field that are mentioning that those policies, both actually enlargement and ENP, are facing with something as a kind of slow process of a crawling renationalization process in a way, so that the member states are trying to get, through variety of different instruments, more and more control over the process, because these policies are really quite important for the EU's well-being. So that was the reason to select those policies. And on top of this, those policies are also one of the most contested. In the volume that I will advertise at the end, a very good colleague of mine, Alexandra Soika, she claims that EU enlargement is actually the most contested policy of the European Union among all domestic and external policies by EU citizens. If you want to get the citizens' divergent opinions, it's actually good policy to take a look at, because enlargement obviously is this kind of double side or double edge policy. It is on the one hand a main instrument to order relations with some of our crucial neighbors at the moment, and at the same time this is a policy, a polity-making policy, right? It's foreign policy that fundamentally changes the polity. And I wanted to contrast this with ENP, because ENP is not, right? ENP is actually a continuation. If you go into the original documents behind the European neighborhood policy from the beginning of 2000 years, if you go to the famous Romano Prodi and Christopher Patton letter, you'll go that I think it's the Prodi's wording that we want to share all but institutions, right? And that's the kind of background of European neighborhood policy, is to use the knowledge, the know-how, the institutional memory of transformation, which was perceived and is still, even though we probably question it more and more. It was claimed to be the enlargement to be the most successful aspect of European foreign policy. So they wanted to use that experience, but turn it into something, some instrument that is not necessarily doing this polity changing aspect, right? So they linked. But ENP is core foreign policy. It is to the external actors, and it's not that much contested. So the question was also to compare those two policies to see what happens when you have this growing contestation of different actors domestically about those policies, right? So that was the rationale to go behind, and you're familiar with those, so I'll skip it. So we talk here about essentially most of the EU's neighbors within those two policies. When it comes to the EU candidates, you have them on the EU map with the current candidates and potential candidates. Obviously, we have Turkey here, which will go back or will return, while I will be showing you some results, because this is the most important and difficult candidate at the moment. We also covered in our research Iceland, but it's gone from the list, because as you know, if you go to the Commission website, it says that Iceland asked not to be mentioned as a candidate anymore, right? So, but when we were doing the research, it was still a candidate. So some claims concerning Iceland will also be discussed, but it's not on the map. So we stick with those countries, and obviously, as I said, one of the origins of the ENP is the enlargement fatigue, the idea not only among the citizens that this is a kind of problematic policy and that we somehow need to discuss where Europe should end, possibly, or where the limits of Europe lie, as Prodi put it famously, leads up to the European neighbourhood policy. So I will not really talk much more about the origins of the policy, because you probably know it all. But these are obviously, the brown color behind me is the neighbourhood policy, and obviously you can also see here immediately the original sin of the policy, so to say, because it actually combines two very two is very very limited idea of having two regions. I mean, I see four at least, but we very often refer to the southern dimension and the eastern dimension, but questioning. But obviously you have a very diverse group of countries within the European neighbourhood policy that are covered in this policy, was a very different state of the political, economic, social development, and also in a very, very diverse need of the EU's assistance. So we will talk about it a little bit later. And obviously the last but not least probably cause to be interested in those policies is that it actually gets worse in those neighborhoods around Europe. Maybe you will help me find some noble examples of more stabilization, more prosperity, more democracy. But when you take a general look, it's actually, as I think I took it from Bertelsmann's foundation event, but also there were other events under this banner, from Ring of Friends, we see the Ring of Fire. So our point was what happened and how do we make sense of this, and basically what citizens are thinking and what the political representatives are saying about this fire that's going on. And obviously those policies require a further thinking. I was just opening today a European Commission sort of contribution to the forthcoming unofficial European Council meeting in Sibiu on the future of Europe. And neighborhood is there, and enlargement is there in this document. And so, in other words, whenever you look, you have the reflection on what we do, because we more or less stabilized in many senses the situation, but it's, I think in terms of the policy process, we still are searching for solutions. We have frozen conflicts, we have open conflicts in the east, in the south, and they are crucial for Europeans because every poll that is done among European citizens is showing us that they know that their security, stability, and prosperity depends on the situation in the neighbors. We are obviously witnessing now some solutions on the table. We have practically frozen negotiations with Turkey as a follow-up of the events in that country. On the positive note, we have since beginning of 2018 a renewal of the enlargement process with the Balkan strategy. When it comes to the ENP, we are now dealing with the double revised neighborhood policy. It was revised in 2011 for the first time and since then called revised, and we have now reformed in 2015 European neighborhood policy. I think still searching for solutions, specifically in both regional dimensions, so Union for Mediterranean and Eastern Partnership. So that's the background, right? So technically, when we wanted to know what's going on with those policies domestically, our undercurrent of our research was question how citizens legitimize foreign policy, right? How do they justify, and their representatives, obviously in the foreign policy area, there is an ongoing debate, which I will not cover that much, about how much citizens can and should be involved in democratic control, in legitimization, how much do they know, how much are they interested in. Our answer to this was to go for something that we call a foreign policy elite. Following several research schemes, researchers argue that if you want really to know, if you really want to make a contribution, you go for the foreign policy elites. And they are very usually parliamentarians, experts that are interested, journalists that are writing on those issues, academics, young professionals that are working in the NGO, civil society organizations that are dealing with those actions. So that's our, so we followed the kind of path, and we wanted to look into how those foreign policy elites are actually contesting those two policies. Obviously, as I said, our starting point was also the reflection by scholars such as Helena Sjursen, whom I'm quoting in the slides behind me, that observed already years ago, almost a decade ago, that foreign and security policy, also on the European level, is perhaps no longer an issue that citizens and parliaments are willing to blindly put into the hands of the executive. So that's our starting point. We know that foreign policy is executive dominated. It's growingly executive dominated. But yet at the same time, what we see together with the spreading of the social media is that the citizens are having probably more interest in foreign policy, or sort of easier access to information, and that the positive and negative effects of globalizations are actually becoming one of the cleavages, or the assessment of globalization is becoming one of the cleavages that are actually coming into our domestic political divisions. And that's something that scholars are observing in the last decade or so, so that this is something that going back close to us. And so we decided to focus on contestation, right? I'm going back to, or arriving to the contestation. So what's contestation? And how do scholars understand it? Well, when it comes to the European integration, I think the first comment should be that we need to distinguish between a polity and policy contestation. Polity contestation is essentially a hardcore Euroscepticism. It's the Eurosceptic view that says the EU maybe should not be here, or should not have that much power as it has, or should not expand anymore. While policy contestation is more about the assessment and expression of critical view or the practice of discontent and criticism, as Antti Wiener puts that, of a particular development in a policy. And that's a very important division between the polity and policy contestation, because we are interested in the critical opinions, but not only and precisely, not exactly about those who are contesting the EU as an actor. I mean, we see them, you'll see some of those opinions in our results, but we were specifically interested in those that are pro-EU, but they are having a growingly divergent views about how and why EU is engaging in the world, and especially in relations with neighbors, and to understand where this criticism actually leads us, in a way. Can we see some change? And our time frame was 10 years, so you'll see some, a decade of sort of opinions, and they different. So we were interested in who, what, how, and why is criticizing about EU's actions within those two policies, right? And obviously you have two dimensions into this. The first dimension that is really pretty critical is established studies on party politics. Because obviously the policy contestation is predominantly organized along the party lines. So one part of this research is really about what the European and national political parties are talking about those policies, and you'll see in a minute in our result that this is really not that much research, which was a surprise to me because I thought that we know much about it, and moreover that the parties are actually having a visible views on that one, which again is not necessarily the case, which also kind of is interesting, and especially it is interesting today when we have growing number of parties that we don't necessarily even know what they think about a foreign policy. And I'll probably bring some names of the leaders maybe later on. So that's sort of one kind of stream of literature that you can see is the studies on Euroscepticism, but also sort of studies on the position of the party politics. And in foreign policy, you also have a national preferences. And you also have a kind of national views. And this is the space where these are really expressed in the forum or the fora we really looked in. So I'll show you both the sort of ideological and national preference kind of battle in a way, or contestation or interest. Finally, when you search for kind of places where it happens, where this contestation really is located, I found really kind of inspiring role theory. This is a constructivist approach. I think most of you are familiar with the role theory research that originates from the 70s. We did not really capture EU roles. What we borrowed from the guys dealing with the role theory is that they actually, specifically, those scholars such as Carbo and others, they actually look at the contestation of an actor roles, domestic contestation. And within that, they build a kind of arenas of contestation. So they create this horizontal and vertical kind of map of the places where this contestation happens, and helps us to grasp the actors that are engaged. Specifically, that this contestation happens on national level, between national kind of arenas among member states, and then you have the supranational level, right? So it's kind of a complicated, in the end of the day, a kind of multi-level system of a contestation and in each levels you have executive, legislative powers, and also public opinion, and also civil society organizations. We're also drawing a little bit from the multi-level parliamentary field, specifically by Jon-Erik Fossum and Ben Krum, the idea that the parliaments are also linking, because what I will show you today is only parliaments. We were doing also the expert communities in several member states and on the EU level, but I will not talk about it very much. So why parliaments? Well, because it's the natural place you should really go. The first kind of direction you go should be parliament, because this is really designed to contain a control over the foreign policy. both on the EU level and on the national levels. But we were not really interested in the institutional control. Other scholars also present in this room are doing this. So we were not going there. What we wanted to see is within this multi-level field, what do they say? How do they say? How they contest, and whether they contest it similarly when they talk on European level and when they talk on national level, and how these policies that we selected are framed. So let me go to the results. Before, obviously, methodology, which is what we did a qualitative content analysis. We analyzed a so-called evaluative claims. We borrowed from the political claims analysis by Staram Koopmans, which was, as some of you may know, is mostly used for analyzing public sphere. So it mostly goes into the media sphere, not necessarily purely for parliament. So scholars that are doing this in parliaments, they say that the parliamentarians are specific actors. So this is kind of simplified scheme. An evaluative claim by parliamentarian means the moment when a given parliamentarian in a selected place, it could be at the plenary or committee, speaks about those policies. We selected 3 national parliaments, mostly because we speak language. So we did the House of Commons. When we started this project, there was no Brexit on site. So that's something that I want to stress. Even though analyzing I will show you House of Commons debates on EU foreign policy, at least I can speak for myself, it really helped me to understand how it was possible that Brexit really started. So at least on that front, it was revealing. Same Polish Parliament and the Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, and then the European Parliament in the 2004-2014, so 2 terms in office. So altogether, more than 100 debates that were selected and analyzed through the software by Provalis. We were essentially trying to get to the very simple research question, which is what are the patterns of legitimization and contestation of those 2 policies by political actors in those parliaments. So let's go to the European Parliament. The first and foremost question that we ask is like, who was speaking and for whom these policies were important. So you have here on the slides behind me, you have all of the debates for EU enlargement and ENP. We pre-selected them, so we gathered all of the debates that were concerning the issues related to those policies, and we pre-selected a number of debates for each policy. So obviously, specifically for EU enlargement, that's significant that these are pre-selected because specifically the debates on Turkey were raising contestation, as you will see in a minute. But it's interesting to see if you actually go into EU enlargement, you can see that obviously the German delegation is leading this, which is not a surprise because it's the biggest one. So they speak the most often. But if you go here, it's already interesting that the 4th biggest delegation speaking on EU enlargement are Greek MEPs, for instance, right? So you can already see in the kind of in the statistical analysis of who's, and it's important to note, these are already evaluative claims. So these are only those statements in the debates that actually included references to those policies. I mean, in the European Parliament, it's easy because the European Parliament is organizing, as you know, the thematic debates on that one. But we somehow did not calculate some technical positions or if someone was not speaking on the theme. ENP is actually even more interesting. You can see the polls in here. So you can sort of see that some national delegations were finding those policies specifically important. So Poles and Romanians are actually the most frequent speakers within this. I'll show you later on some of the sort of statistical word use. So the keywords that they were using, which also shows very much that they basically are promoting very much the national agenda. So it's even though they do that in a very specific way, which I will also show you. And then obviously we have Germany and United Kingdom in the ENP debates, which also is not surprising, and then France, Italy. Also, if you look into the end, you have small countries because obviously they have less MEPs. For instance, the position of Denmark on here is just showing very clearly that they're just not interested. And here, for instance, Portugal is also the country that is not really very much, or the delegation that was not interested.